Welcome to the third in our new series, Wise Words, a deep dive into contemplative science, hosted by the Contemplative Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne. I'm Nicholas Van Dam, and I'm the director of the centre. I'd like to begin today's session by respectfully acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land in which many of us find ourselves residing today. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to any First Nations people that may be joining us for this event today. Today, we're joined by Dr. Sonam Thakchoe, Senior Philosophy Lecturer at the University of Tasmania. Sonam teaches Asian philosophy, coordinates the Asian Philosophy Program, and directs the Tasmanian Buddhist Studies in India exchange program. Sonam's research focuses on Indo-Tibetan Madhyamaka philosophy, with a particular emphasis on ontology, epistemology, ethics, and Buddhist philosophy of mind. In today's presentation, Sonam will argue that phenomenology holds the center stage of all Buddhist contemplative and philosophical practices because the critical analysis of direct first-person experience, otherwise known as vedanā, is at its core concern at the beginning, the middle, and the end. If you have any questions during the talk, please post them in the Q&A, and Sonam will address as many of those questions as possible towards the end of the session. Thank you for joining us, and welcome, Sonam.
Thank you very much, Professor Nicholas Van Dam, and also Dr. Colin Joyce, who initially extended me this honor, and Kathleen and Daniel, who also helped organize the event. It's a great pleasure and honor to be presenting this paper at the Center of Contemplative Studies and as part of Melbourne University. So if, without further ado, let me share the screen so that we can get going. Okay, so essentially, I have titled my presentation of paper as Vipassana meditation as a rigorous phenomenology. Now, those of you who have done or Vipassana courses, 10-day courses, or of course, senior students have done 20-day, 30-day courses, they would know what Vipassana is. And those of you who have done even maybe basic 10-day courses, you would also roughly know what it is involved. But for those of you who haven't done or come across what Vipassana is, let me briefly just give you what Vipassana is, and then how it is tied to phenomenology general. So in doing so, essentially, our paper is going to look like this. What I'm going to do, talk briefly about what Vipassana is, then phenomenology in general, especially those of you who have never come across or not studied phenomenology, and meditation, or even especially Vipassana meditation. My focus is especially going to be these, what I call the significance of first-person direct experience, because after all, Vipassana or meditation and phenomenology too focus on the study of experience, especially subjective, first-person subjective experience. So that's this is going to be the center stage. I'll also problematize, because there is assumption, of course, generally people make assumption that because it is a direct experience, it must be much more reliable. Anything that is not direct experience can be suspect, or maybe you can be suspicious, just like Cartesian doubting, or even Husserlian bracketing. You can doubt anything that is sensorial or things, knowledge that comes from experiences. But some people say, because your subjective experience is immediate, it must be much more reliable. But certainly you will see that is actually under attack from Buddhist phenomenological tradition, because Buddhists would argue, in fact, Vipassana tradition certainly argues that this so-called subjective experience can be really the building, you could say, the beginning of the problem of phenomenology, because based on the first person direct experience, we construct something called first person subject. And the question is whether there is such a thing called first person subject that actually stand aloof, independent from the metrics of experience. And the conclusion you will notice is actually from Vipassana standpoint, there is no such subject. It's a matrix of phenomena arising and passing away, but nothing that stand outside there that doesn't change. So that will be under question. So, and then I will argue that Vipassana as a meditation or as a meditation technique that takes us to that level. Because after all, there's a reason why Vipassana tradition is a meditative exercise rather than as a philosophical exercise. Philosophical exercise, whether it is phenomenological, epistemological, metaphysics, usually is a conceptual, rational exercise that you do in the head, but not necessarily bring to the level of body, bring to the level of experience. Meditation, many of the meditation exercise actually to go back to the level of one's experience. So that's why you will see the difference. Okay, so that's going to be the structure of my presentation. Now, I have a lot of slides you will notice, and I'm going to, some of them just going to be spent maybe in a minute or less. So that's essentially to help me to also to stay focused with my presentation so that I don't unnecessarily get, distracted or digress from the main part. Now, Vipassana as a tradition, of course, the technique originally was taught by Gautama the Buddha around 6th century BC. And then the tradition, of course, claims that a chain of teachers had maintained this unbroken lineage. And most recent teacher, and my own teacher, and probably thousands of Vipassana practitioners around the world, our immediate teacher is S.N. Goenka. So Goenka is the immediate contemporary teacher. Well, when I say contemporary, of course, passed away in 2013 when he was 89. So, but of course, he trained so many teachers, and so the Vipassana movement is still, of course, very much alive and very much, going very strong. But he was trained by Seaji Upakin, a Burmese teacher, and Seaji Upakin was influenced by Lady Sayadaw and Seatet. Particularly Seatet is a lay person, so trained in the Vipassana tradition. So in the end, as a Vipassana student myself, of course, maybe it's in the beginning, I should make this also clear that I am not presenting official line of a Vipassana sort of a doctrine. I'm just presenting as a Vipassana student my own reflection, how Vipassana as a meditation practice needs to be understood, and also in relation to contemporary studies on phenomenology and so forth. Okay, so essentially, Vipassana emphasizes on what are called pillars. There are 3 pillars that all Buddhist tradition generally, of course, emphasize. One is the pillar of the moral pillar, and that is called Shila, where every Vipassana course or training, the trainee needs to take certain precepts, abstention from killing, stealing, sexual activity, speaking falsely, intoxicants. And then, of course, the more senior students will have to add at least 3 different precepts on top of it, including abstention of afternoon, eating afternoon, using luxurious bed, using decorations and so forth. That's the ethical foundation. The second training is to involve the training of samadhi, concentration, single-pointedness. This is important training, important pillar, because without some concentrated, single-pointed, or some ability for us to remain focused in one particular project, we know that mind is unable to achieve its goal. So therefore, that's the second training. The third training is, of course, Vipassana. So once you got these two, Shila, the moral foundation, and the Samadhi, concentration foundation strong, then you can move to the third pillar or third training, and that training is Vipassana. Technically, Vipassana means basically the cognitive faculty for us to be able to observe things as they are, without presumption, without judgment, without looking at from the surface level, but basically looking at things as they are, right? So that ability is developing that ability skill is the primary object of Vipassana meditation. And then finally, of course, usually that does not be included as the three pillars, but in Vipassana meditation, usually there is a fourth training, and that is training in the loving kindness meditation, which usually teacher introduces almost at the end of the course. Okay, so having done briefly, and that's I'll return to what Vipassana practice actually involves. But before I do that, let me introduce briefly, with the help of Professor Jay Garfield's book, Why Buddhism Matters. He uses this term phenomenology and this is exactly how I like to use it. I don't want to use phenomenal broadly at this point, because I just want to set the relationship between phenomenology and Vipassana meditation. And you'll notice that, of course, there is no such thing called one phenomenology. There are different ways of doing phenomenology. But phenomenology generally is a broad, rather elastic study or analysis of the structure of experience, cognitive processes, structures that help us to or enable us to experience things. And primarily, of course, at the center of phenomenological study is the study of subjectivity. And that's where I want to actually focus my presentation, because that is where the host of worms, if you like, will come up if we really analyze what is this subjectivity doing. So phenomenology generally is also understood as a first-person subject point, or first-person stance, the people wants to call it, and that's why it is a deep exploration. So in the West, of course, beginning with Husserl, because he is supposed to be the founder of at least phenomenology and European phenomenology, and he has his own brand of phenomenology. And you will notice this is actually from critical Vipassana meditation. Husserlian phenomenology comes under attack, because Husserlian phenomenology literally brackets its sensory experiences, just like Descartes does through his universal doubting, but leaves universal subject, or what you call transcendental subject. And that transcendental subject is nothing other than what is called ecological subject, and is supposedly the fundamental or the unnecessary condition for any cognition, any consciousness that arise. And that does not, subject is maintained, and it is very much sequestered, if in fact, using appliqué or bracketing, he does rigorously with other senses or other epistemic resources, but that the subject, transcendental subject, is very much being kept and maintained and defended. So you will notice that exactly is one that will come under attack from Buddhist phenomenology, especially phenomenology of Vipassana. Okay, so now let's look at what Vipassana technically is from the etymological standpoint. Etymological standpoint, Vipassana, when I use this word, is a Pali term, and Vipassana is a Sanskrit. But basically, the particle V has to do usually with two special or a different or multiple ways. Pasha is to see things. So technically, the idea is Vipassana is to develop that skill so that we can see things in different ways, from different angles, at a different order, right? Not just from one direction. So it has to be multidimensional or multidirectional. That's what Vipassana is. And the whole exercise or meditation training is to develop that art so that we are able to see things more clearly, more correctly, going deeper from the surface level. Because generally when we look at from visually, we get to listen to see things only from the surface, what technically Buddhists would call conventional truth. But we don't get to see what is at the depth. And Vipassana, the task of Vipassana is to take the meditator to the depth of their experience. So then they're able to experience at this stage, they understand the nature and the structure of what you call subjectivity. What is this called first person subject? What is the content structure for the first person subjective experience, and how do we construct self from that point? So in other words, Vipassana comes to communicate a sense of seeing things as they really are, in a special way, or more appropriately in a correct way, right? And from a different angles. So that's the task, or in fact the goal of developing or cultivating Vipassana meditation. All right, so then you could ask, what is the center? What is the significance of experience in the Vipassana meditation? Well, of course, as you have noticed from the Kalama Sutta that I've quoted, Buddha was warning actually against the Kalamas. And these Kalamas are interesting people. They're a group of kind of skeptics, but maybe their skepticism is kind of warranted because they met so many teachers, and each of their teachers make counterclaims, and they would say that we have authority, just follow us, we will enlighten you. And because each teachers would make the same claim, given India is a land of gurus, then they basically got lost. And so they approached Buddha, and and thought that Buddha would be able to help. But what Buddha did was actually he said, yeah, certainly don't take reason, don't take authority seriously when it comes to knowledge, whether it is the reason, rationality, or even that's something that you basically directly see with your own vision, or the tradition that you actually belong to. What Buddha said is, of course, this at the heart here is, whenever you know for yourself, these things are unwholesome, these things are blameless, these things are praised by the wise, these things, if accepted and untaken, lead to welfare and happiness, then you should live in accordance with them. Now, warning against taking knowledge or taking authority seriously, but at the same time, Buddha was basically asking Kalamas to step up, literally, that you're responsible for the acquisition of the knowledge that in the end would serve, whether to liberate or to remain in the slavery of ignorance. So there you can see Buddha is pointing straight to the direct experience. And here also in this, you could say the founder of modern phenomenological tradition, Edmund Husserl himself, basically very nicely put that natural knowledge starts with an experience, and remains in experience. This is exactly the point that Buddha was making, because phenomenology, you will notice that actually it holds the center stage of all Buddhist contemplative as well as philosophical exercises. And here, in a text called Brahmanet Sutra, Buddha affirms this very nicely. He says, actually, he was able to attain awakened precisely because he was able to awaken his own experiences. Having experienced as they really are, the rising of sensations, they passing away, the relishing of them, the danger in them, and the release from them, the enlightened one monks is fully liberated, being free from all attachment. In other words, the Buddha's claim is that he was able to attain enlightenment or awaken. He was able to become awakened, fully awakened, because he was able to wake up from his own experience. And then Buddha goes even further in this sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya. And this is what Buddha says, to one who experiences vedanā, vedanā is a technical, well, it's a not necessarily technical term. Vedanā basically means the experience, or mostly our teacher Goenkaji translate as a sensation. So if I translate sensational experience, basically I'm, in this case, I'm taking them as synonymous. So basically, Buddha in this sutta, he says, to one who experiences vedana, I teach the truth of suffering, I teach the truth of the rising of suffering, I teach the truth of cessation of suffering, and I teach the truth of path leading to the cessation of suffering. The implication being that if there is somebody who does not know experience, cannot experience things, there is no way that Buddha can introduce those three teachings, or teaching the Four Noble Truths. Because the implication there is to be really understand, to be able to understand those Four Noble Truths as they are from their own perspective. One has to be able to have the ability to experience things. And that's, you can see actually where the significance of experience is clear in this presentation, or in Buddhist phenomenology generally. All right, now the important question is, but then you could say, what is the structure of experience? What is person, after all, in Buddhist tradition? Because then if you really understand what person is, then we can see, or we can try to unpack what experience or structure of experience would involve. Essentially, we are looking at the structure of phenomenological self, or experience. Fundamental to Buddhist position, or Buddhist phenomenology, is the claim that 5 persons, or any persons, remember, it's not just a person as a human beings, we're talking about persons, all sentient beings, cows, buffaloes, dogs, all are persons. Persons basically, persons is defined here as the person as somebody who is constituted by 5 aggregates. And in other words, person is one that is dependently designated upon 5 aggregates. And 5 aggregates exhaustively explain the structure of a human experience. And these are the 5 aggregates: the aggregated form, that constitute material aggregate, anything that is material, we could say the aggregate of matter, rupa, the aggregate of sensation, of feeling and experience. Remember, this is the aggregate that and there you can say that aggregate can be divided so many different ways. You can have visual feeling, audio feeling, bodily feeling, at least 6 different ways in which you can experience things. Then perceptions, again, 6 different perceptions, 5 sensory and then mental, if you have, then 6 different perceptions. And then disposition aggregate, within that dispositional aggregate, all types of cognitive processes, including the dysfunctional ones or the correct ones, like mindfulness, attention, intention. Most of them comes under the dispositional aggregate, or called sankhara. And then consciousness aggregate, again, consciousness aggregate. The reason why this aggregate, skandha, is important because it sends the signal that even the consciousness is a cluster concept. There is no one singular thing that you can call consciousness. This type of consciousness is very different from the Cartesian singular consciousness. Remember, in Cartesian or Descartes, you will notice that consciousness and soul are one and the same thing, and it's the singular faculty that has the ability to see, feel, and perform all the cognitive activities. But you won't see that singular cognitive faculty in this case. It's just a cluster of cognitions that works together. The claim here is that also these 5 aggregates basically are relations. They don't stand independently. If one falls, all other falls, right? If, let's say, if there is no consciousness of the form aggregate, all the rest falls away. Just as if there is no perception aggregate, other aggregates would fall away. For this reason, these aggregates are embodied, embedded, and dependently arisen. So therefore, the claim here is these 5 aggregates act as a heap or phenomena which help us to explain what human experience is all about. So the term aggregate signifies a heap of many phenomena since it's a collection and composite of many things, the five aggregates are primary categories upon which we draw, at least Buddhists draw and examine the phenomenological structure of a person. Right. Now, there are several reasons. First reason is this. First reason is because the five aggregates serve as a phenomenological scheme of human experience. If you really want to talk about human experience, these five aggregates and the cluster of the concept actually give us a kind of fairly exhaustive tools to explain what human experience involves, and particularly the existential experiences, and also the possibility of liberation from that. The second reason is that the five aggregates also provide the basis upon which develop the sense of first-person subjectivity. Now, if you look carefully, within the five aggregates, and each of those five aggregates are divisible, remember, and all of them collectively form what called personhood. Now, but there is no singular, and the claim is there is no person or subject that stand beneath or behind those activities. There is no theta. There is, putting in Hume's word, they are just metrics or constant flux of sensations, but there is no theta that actually sits out there. That doesn't change. So in that sense, you can say egocentricity or the first-person subjectivity is something that we as a human being, or we as a epistemic agent, we construct from the cluster of the five aggregates. The question is it justifiable? Is construction unified, static, independent, autonomous agent constructing from cluster of experiences, cluster of events that are constantly arising, passing away? Is that defensible? Is that epistemically reliable? And the conclusion, of course, from Buddhist standpoint or from Vipassana standpoint is that no, they are not. So therefore, that comes under attack. And there is a third reason, and third reason is that five aggregates also act as the objective domain of arising of unskillful and skillful factors. Now, in other words, when we talk about ethics, again, that matters because after all, when we falsely objectify aggregates, reifying them as if there is some sort of underlying reality, underlying subject that does not change, that actually is a fundamental confusion. So when you have if I am fundamentally confused about my own subjective experience and nature of my self, nature of my own structure, that would lead to, at least from Buddhist standpoint, what we call unconscious bias. If I'm not necessarily conscious about everything, but it is this precisely because of unconscious bias that actually leads to other problems that we nowadays talk about fairly openly. For the reason is that five aggregates objective of that's a repetition which I made. And fourth is object domain of awakened knowledge. Again, when you talk about enlightenment or awakening, we don't have to some sort of talk about in the form of transcendence. You are not transcending anything. Actually, it is the precise way of understanding those five aggregates, and that leads to what Buddha claims to awakening. So in that sense, five aggregates are therefore the root of our conception of first-person subject self. It is from this misapprehension of the aggregates or misappropriation of aggregates that unfortunately, from Buddhist standpoint, from the Vipassana standpoint, we create the sense of self. Now, how do we do it? Well, we totalize. We basically unify, assume, and there is a unity in the structure of those experiences, but then create something that is permanent, out of fluid, impermanent, and non-eternal elements. So that's why it is seen as a problematic. Now, here is the 7th century, great 7th century Indian philosopher Chandrakirti. He nicely put this problem in this word. He says, seeing wisely that all afflictive defilements and misfortunes arise from the personality view, and that personality view is essentially nothing other than objectifying those transient composites of the five aggregates. Now, And the job of a meditator, of a Vipassana meditator, is actually to realize that this so-called subject self is to actually basically to see its structure as it is, and then snub it off from the system. In other words, to eradicate, to negate. Now, this, of course, negation is slightly different from how philosophers would do it. If you're a philosopher, you would basically do it logically. But even you do, even you refute the existence of self, subject, logically, unfortunately, it doesn't fix the problem deeper. And because philosophers are still trapped in the same egocentric games, egocentricity, until unless they do the exercise of these, going deeply, there is a problem. And Buddha actually nicely put this problem in his own words. Of course, I won't read the whole thing, but he basically claimed in Majjhima Nikaya that according to him, there is egocentricity, or the first person subjective self, so-called subjectivity, is essentially a myth that we created out of thin air. There is no real ontological basis because everything is transient, constantly changing. And yet we are able to somehow create this myth of fiction that there is an agency or so-called self or subjective stance that is autonomous, independent, and that doesn't change. And he says that that can be done only purely from faith, or just purely assumption, or pure based on oral tradition, or some sort of region cogitation. There is no way that one can actually go and experiment and testify and prove such a thing based on observation. And the problem with basically state this is, he says, just as a dog tied to a post keeps running and circling around the same post, so too those who, out of fear of identity, disgust with identity, keep running and circling around the same identity. Now, Buddha basically claimed or argued that, yes, on the deep surgical analysis of your own subjective self, by using five aggregates, there is no way that you can actually find such identity, such a static identity that is fixed, that is frozen in time. But nevertheless, we do believe. So then the question is, why do we believe such a thing? And that, of course, is the question here. Now, Buddha and Chandrakirti makes of important, what are called, at least gives us three different arguments to understand why and how we create subjectivity out of these five aggregates. The first argument is this. The argument is that the sense of first-person subject stance stems from the reification of things which oughtn't be reified. They are transient, composite five aggregates, where self or subjective self is something that's unchanging. They're supposed to be sitting there as an observer, some unchanging, almost like a metaphysical stance. If there is a solid substantial self or a subject, it must be found amongst the aggregates. But the aggregates are very opposite of the substantial. They are ephemeral, momentary. Nevertheless, we somehow reify them by either by identifying the aggregates individually or collectively as I, me, or mine, right? So that's one important at least claim, or if you want argument that to keep in our mind. You might actually challenge this argument. And the second one is that because we have created this myth of the first person subjective self out of thin air with no basis and out of confusion, now there is so much of investment. I'm invested with the enormous conflict, because I know that this subject self is the most precious thing. And as a result, anything that comes in, anything that contests it, anything that tests its, let's say, desirability becomes a problem. So, of course, anger, hatred, desires, likes and dislikes, all things, all those what we call prejudices or biases, automatically comes precisely because of this deep subjective self, or the sense of self that I have. So these are the claim here, or the argument is that these dysfunctional cognitive or biases that we have are triggered because of the sense of subject. Okay, so in the end, the claim here is also these types of sufferings that we go through because of my own attachment and the loss of those objects that I am attached to, the loss of the sensation, the pleasant sensation, and then also the encounter with unpleasant sensation. Those things arises because of my own prejudice and biases, and that prejudice and biases again comes back, are basically deeply seated in this sense of self that I have. So to carve self and other from the aggregate is to carve up interconnected world of being or a person into spheres of identification and preferences in relation to which afflictive emotions be generated. So anything that my self prefers, there I love them. Anything that my subjective self does not prefer, those things are something that I hate. So by verifying the aggregates, we engage the phenomenological world in a way which only accumulates the cause of suffering. Okay, almost running out of time. And then there's a third argument, and third argument is that these aggregates are the source of misconception of first person subject self. And in order to, if we really want to revise our knowledge and basically get rid of that confusion, then again, the route to do this character view, to develop the character view of a personhood is nothing other than those, again, going back to 5 aggregates. Because after all, if we have a personhood is something that is constructed out of 5 aggregates, then it is those 5 aggregates that needs to be understood properly. So therefore, Buddhist phenomenology essentially says the practitioner must attain direct knowledge of those 5 aggregates, and that's the job of essentially Buddhist phenomenology. So in that sense, Buddhist phenomenology, task of Buddhist phenomenology begins with observation and analysis of first-person direct experience, beginning with ordinary experience, how we ordinary experience construct the self from first-person direct experience, and then gradually introduce, you could say, radical trainings to eventually come out from that misconception or that dogma of the first person subject self, which is conceptually constructed based on the first person subjective experience. Okay, now let me go. I think we'll skip this. So the question is, how does Vipassana actually meditation address this first person subjective problem? Well, the Vipassana, I think there are the range of ways in which Vipassana directly address this. The first thing Vipassana does is when a student is asked to observe of the body sensations, when they observe it, eventually, of course, it might take some time, but eventually they will notice that the experiences constantly arises. In the beginning, you'll see, in the beginning, maybe you may not actually experience anything. You may not actually experience the whole body. So in order to develop the sensitivity, one has to develop anapanasati, concentration, calm abiding based on observation of breath. So by using the observation of breath and single-pointedly focusing on here, mind becomes much more sharp, single-pointed. And as a result, in the around day 4, mind becomes quite sharp enough. Then now, if you actually try to scan your body, you may be able to feel, literally your body. Now, even though you are able to feel it, but it takes some time for us to actually understand arising of the sensation, production, literally arising of the sensation. So arising of sensation is basically showing that those experiences arises. And then again, with a sustained observation, you'll notice that that also passes away, arises, passes away, arises, passes away. And at a certain point, It in the beginning, you could say that it arises, the experience stays, and then passes away. Arises, stays, passing away. And then if you keep observing, it becomes faster and faster. And you'll notice that it arises, passes away, arises, passes away. And at a certain point, it becomes much faster. And then you'll notice that the moment it arises, the moment it passes away. So then when you look at the whole structure of your experience, so-called first subjective experience, first person direct experience, whole experience is a flux of change. There is nothing other than change, constant, what our teacher would call oscillation. So that's the job of basically task Vipassana to develop that sensitivity, to be able to go deep within one's own 5 aggregates and develop that ability to observe. I mean, you just observe, not doing anything. You are not visualizing, you are not imagining, you are just observing things as they are. And they are like, these sensations are more like bubbles. They are just crop, arises, passes away, and then arises. Now, why is this important? This is important because this is what in Vipassana, this wisdom, this is called wisdom, this is called knowing. That knowing is expressed with the word sambhajana. Sambhajana essentially means the thorough knowing or knowing of one's own experience. So once we have a full experience of our own understanding of our own experience, then of course it is possible that one can gradually be free from the addictive nature of these experience, because otherwise our experiences are so addictive. Either you are repelled by those experiences, addictive either because you are attracted by those experiences, or addictive in the sense that you are indifferent to those experiences. So in that sense, yes, Vipassana job actually is to develop this sambhajana, which allows us to see the knowledge, with the knowledge, the impermanence and not self-characteristic of mind-made of causation. In other words, Vipassana meditator is to develop these first-person direct experience. First thing they need to develop is the arising of first-person direct experience. Second, passing away the first-person direct experience. And then third, simultaneously arising and passing away of first-person direct experience. And if we develop that type of deep understanding through what are called rigorous phenomenological observation analysis, then there is no room to construct. There is no room to construct the first-person subjective self. And that automatically disappears. Okay, so, and there are of course different ways. At least teacher in the main manual that we use, Vipassana Satipatthana Sutta introduces 4 different ways in which you can cultivate Vipassana. And this is how the text and the Buddha nicely put it. It says the 4 establishing awareness is the only way for the purification of beings, for overcoming sorrow, for ending suffering, for walking on the path of truth, for realizing freedom and liberation. All right. So those 4 basically, now because of time is running out, let me try to draw some quick conclusion. But before that, these are the 4 techniques or 4 phenomenological methods Mahasatipatthana, the manual Vipassana actually endorses. The observation of the body, the observation of body sensation, the observation of mind, and observation of mental contents. Kaya Anupassana, Vedana Anupassana, Chitta Anupassana, and Dhamma Anupassana. Dhamma Anupassana in the sense, when you observe your mind, you're actually looking at the contents of mind. So basically Vipassana, in the Vipassana training itself, teacher introduces us to initially to the observation of the body, because that's the easiest. But you can observe the body only when you actually feel something on the body. So therefore, observation of body sensation becomes natural. And in 20-day, 30-day, teacher introduces the observation mind and mental content, because they are a little bit more complex and deeper. All right. So now we don't have enough time to discuss, but what the essence of Vipassana is actually to develop these 3, or in fact 4 different types of wisdoms, or what you call 4 different types of direct knowing of impermanence, direct knowing of suffering, direct knowing of not self, and direct knowing of empty nature of five aggregates. So with this knowledge, and if we were able to go deeper within our experience, that basically really deconstructed the whole idea of subjective self. And this is also how Buddha puts in the vedanā, which he says, in one media who perceives impermanence, the perception of not self is established. One who perceives what is not self wins the uprooting of the pride of egotism in this very life, and thus realizes nibbana. So in other words, this the idea of egocentricity or first-person subjective self, from Buddhist standpoint or from Vipassana standpoint, is the very heart of the problem. And in order to be free oneself away from that, then of course Vipassana takes this truth training so seriously. Okay, so let me end by reading you this quote. And this quotation is coming from Sattama Smriti Upasthana Sutra. The text, very detailed text on the application awareness of mindfulness or awareness. Here Buddha says, the spiritual practitioner who carefully considers and attends to the internal body will also see the impermanence, suffering, emptiness, and absence of self with respect to all beings. With this understanding, he does not remain before the maras. Maras essentially the confusion, or in fact, you could say the Buddhist version of devil that creates confusion. Doesn't mean that there is some external Mara out sitting there, but literally one's own ignorance. But finds within himself the reality of transcendence of suffering. He is not led astray by desirable sounds, textures, tastes, forms, smells that involve affliction. He is not bound by the craving that accompanies lustful desire. He is free from the dust of afflictions. He is safe from all precipices. He is not distracted by forms of smells. He does not arouse any excitement over appearances, and he does not arouse any excitement over youthfulness. Well, that's it. I will draw in my presentation to conclude, and I look forward to hear certain questions and objections and criticism to my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. We've got a number of questions starting to come through, and while they do, I may just pose a question myself. So that there's in these kinds of conversations, in these debates, particularly with mixed audiences, I think one thing that often comes up is the I guess the stickiness, or kind of the intuitiveness that we have in the sense of self, as it feels like it ought to be there. It feels very genuine. It feels very, and often for many people, it feels very important to them. And we certainly know from child developmental literature that the emergence or the development of a sense of self actually is quite important. And if they don't develop that sense of self, that there could be issues in terms of that individual's development. So I guess the question then comes to this, well, I guess it's twofold. One is sort of, would you suggest that clinging to a sense of self is inherently a bad thing? Is the presence of self bad? And I guess as people are coming to this realization or changing the way that they view their sense of self, do you have any thoughts or suggestions about how to help people essentially so that they don't have a major existential crisis or kind of freak out, so to speak, which are Cullen's words, so as people kind of come to realize that, oh, this sense of self that was so important to me, and may have sort of kind of helped me ground and explain my world, as I come to realize that that's actually not there, I guess, what do people do with that? How do they kind of come out of that on the other side, still coherent in some meaningful way?
Thank you, Nicholas, for the question. Yes, I think it's one of those, as you said, a sticky point, and it is precisely because of that people tend to believe that there is something, even though on close observation, it turns out there is no such a thing. Now, in fact, even science tells us that actually might be the case, even though, of course, there are, still scientists who still may, kind of there might be something a little bit iffy or maybe mystical. Now, traditional Buddhist way or Vipassana approach is actually to teach students to be realistic in the beginning. The reason why we actually go and face what we call identity crisis is because from the childhood in the beginning, we teach them or something that something that wasn't there. We literally force onto them to believe, and this is the partly cultural problem, and I think what we call conventional problem, because conventional knowledge is based on how things appear, how things look like, and the all surface level type of knowledge, and we literally sort of thrust on child to believe on those sort of naive, reified understanding of what person is. And then, of course, later on, when they realize there is no such thing, then, of course, identity crisis comes up. So the problem, I think I see it as the solution is literally from the very beginning, it is important for anybody to try to understand this deep question, to be realistic. What is it there actually? And not to go beyond believing what is there. If we go beyond believing something that wasn't there, and like a Christmas father, people told whole stories about Christmas father, bring all this gift, and students, sometimes child do believe such a things because parents tell them a story that is so real, and they tend to literally believe the story. And then once they realize that actually there isn't one, then it actually identity crisis happens. So I think probably the most pragmatic way to resolve this problem is actually to be realistic and let them see for themselves, if possible, and understand things as they really are. Namely, that person is a relationship, just like a car, just like any other thing in the universe. Is a matrix of so many conditions that is being made up of lots of things together. There is no one singular thing. And if you believe there is a one singular thing, and it turns out on analysis they doesn't, then of course the problem arises. So I think the advice Buddha gave to his followers, because remember when Buddha introduced this concept, it is a totally radical in the landscape of India, because all Indians believe in the soul. Atman is literally universally believed. And here is the teacher who says, look, take seriously and then analyze and show me where it is. If there is anything in the solid entity, permanent entity that sits in you that hasn't changed, just where it is. If it is there, even when you analyze, then it should be literally demonstrable. But if there isn't, then there is no way, there is no point in believing. And I think perhaps the way to avoid problem of that kind, especially identity crisis, actually to be more realistic and to say, okay, look, things are network of relations. There is no one thing. Persons are network of relations. There is no one thing that makes you. There is no one thing that makes me. It's not the self, that sort of mythical self. It's the biological, it's the neurological, it's the environmental, all this language and all this stuff, cultural stuff and all this. So therefore, interconnected network, introducing them child from the very infancy. That's how things really are. Maybe they're actually the positive way to go, rather than making them believe in something that wasn't there initially.
Thank you for that. Another question, which I think starts to get at perhaps responsibility or free will, even. So the question sort of, I guess, there's kind of two questions, but they kind of get at the same idea. If ultimately sort of there is no identity or no person or no individual, then who is it that is deciding to meditate? And essentially, who, when you talk about someone doing the observing, who is doing the observing?
Terrific. Thank you. Yes, I thought that question would come up. Because yes, that's the precise reason why many traditions think that there is observer. When you meditate and sit, there is observer. Well, they might be, yes, on the surface of it, they looks like observer, just like there's a unified self that is always constantly there. Now, on the critical analysis, the way in which Buddha explained, and from also the tradition of Vipassana, when we look at how consciousness arises, there is no such thing consciousness in the brain. It is not in the head, not in the eye, not in nose, not in tongue. But consciousness arises when the conditions comes together. So I have a visual consciousness of you at the moment because you are present. There's a light. I got a proper visual faculty, and then also other conditions are met, and therefore I am able to see, and that's what we call visual cognition, visual consciousness. But that consciousness is not somewhere sitting in my head. But if it were, then of course you don't have to appear on the screen. There is no reason if my visual consciousness of you, your presence is already present, then there is no need for other conditions. So certainly in Buddhist tradition, consciousness it's not something that is pre-exists in the head. It's not like ego trapped. It's not Descartes' ego that is trapped in the body. There is no such thing. Consciousness requires biological, neurological factors, but at the same time, you need light and proper distance, and the object appears. When those things appear, then I have a visual cognition that comes up. In the same way, the sound that here, visual audio consciousness or ear consciousness, sound consciousness. When you say something, and then that basically vibration transmit my ear, and then of course the visual consciousness, also audio or ear consciousness generate. The ear consciousness is not something that pre-exists in the mind. So the myth, the fact that when I sit and meditate, it feels like there is an observer. But the technical response from Buddhist tradition is generally, there is no one unified consciousness. Well, when you observe, you need attention. You need contact. You need memory. You need experience. You need perception. You need intention. You need focus. All these are different types of mental states. Collectively gives you the impression that there is a so-called observer, just like there's 5 aggregates, and collectively gives you the impression there's a personhood or singular person. But with these, in fact, Abhidhamma literature and Buddhist talks about 10 different mental episodes is required for one mental event to occur. Namely, if for me to be able to see what is happening, you need at least minimum 10 different mental states working together, network. And they're called, in fact, 5 are called omnipresent mental factors. Contact has to be there, feeling has to be there, perception has to be there, and the mind or memory has to be there, and then intention, attention has to be there, and there has to be a certain resolution that has to be there, then certain evaluation that has to be there. And when all these things come together, what do you call observer? That's called consciousness. But there is no singular thing that is somewhere hidden somewhere in my head, or either neurological or biologically, that is somehow looking from the top of my head. And that's why when we say there is an observer meditating, when I sit, of course I sit, meditation is my hobby. I meditate a lot, but every time when I look, yes, I need to bring my focus, attention, intention together, pull those together. If they are not there, my mind gets distracted. When my mind gets distracted, there's no meditation. I'm not be sitting like that. But if there's one thing, so-called observer, then there is no need for meditation. Why do you actually meditate? Because observer is already there with you. Has been there sitting, if there is one mythical observer always, you have to actually meditate. So that's how actually traditional Buddhist answer is based on the idea that this consciousness is a cluster concept, just as a personhood is a cluster concept. The belief that there is a one unified subject, so-called observer, is just another myth, Cartesian myth, based on our experience. But on a close observation, turns out it is something that is non-existent. It's again one of the, but it looks so intuitive. It, literally, like conventionally, that looks very appealing, attractive, and that's the problem. And that's why I think partly when we don't do the exercise, if we just philosophize conceptually, and if don't go at the level of body, doing the what scientists do, literally in the body test, then of course we can hypothesize. So that's why I think when we go deeper, at least what we need to do at the sort of Vipassana level, getting at the level of body, then I think it's just turned out that everything so-called consciousness is another relational cluster concept made up of or constituted by so many mental episodes, mental states brought up together and then collectively work. It's exactly like one of the favorite examples in Buddhist tradition, early Buddhist philosophers, meditators used is a cart. And Buddha always used a cart. And he says, when you have a block cart is made of so many different things. You have axle, wheel, and everything collectively, and there's a cart. There is no one thing, the one singular thing that makes a cart a cart. In the same way, I think here, consciousness has the same, understanding.
Thank you. Such fascinating discussion. And I think we could keep talking. I know I could keep talking about this all day. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I think one answer I did hear that I think is particularly interesting, and that comes to my mind sort of is this idea that we do actually have to go beyond, and I guess maybe a key point of your presentation is we have to go beyond just knowing these things or learning about these things academically or cognitively. We actually have to engage with them experientially, and maybe I guess to answer some of these questions, it's in that context, the experiential engagement, that some of this starts to resonate more and make more sense, and maybe some of the concerns that we have about it actually get addressed in a more meaningful way. So thank you so much for this presentation.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your thoughts and your time. Thank you to the audience for joining us. Please subscribe to the newsletter, stay informed about this. We'll post the YouTube video when we have a chance, and to other upcoming events hosted by the Contemplative Studies Center. And we look forward to seeing you next time. And again, Sonam, thank you so much for that wonderful talk.
Thank you very much for your attention and for invitation.